NATO says Afghanistan and Russia are now its top priorities under its new leadership. But what will it take for the organisation to deliver on such thorny issues? And how efficient will its so-called new strategic concept be? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. NATO has a new Secretary-General. The former Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen took over the post this week. He's already been addressing questions on the major conflicts that NATO's involved in, as well as some of the organisation's sensitive international relationships. The challenges he's highlighted include NATO's tentative relations with Russia and its neighbours. He's also said he understands the need for NATO to develop stronger relations with the Muslim world. But at the top of his list of priorities is Afghanistan. NATO has been involved in the conflict for 6 years. But the rising number of civilian casualties has led to resentment towards NATO forces in the country. The new Secretary-General says he would like to see NATO hand over security to the people of Afghanistan.
I believe that during my term as NATO Secretary-General, Afghans must take over lead responsibility for security in most of their country. Let me be clear, I say lead responsibility for the Afghans. NATO must and will be there in support. Let no Taliban propagandist try to sell my message as a run for the exit. It is not.
Well, joining us now are our guests. In Washington, D.C., Doug Bando. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. That's a think tank focusing on issues of public policy and peace. In London, Daniel Korski, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Kuala Lumpur, Professor Inderjit Palmer. He's head of politics at the University of Manchester in the UK. If I can start with you, Daniel Korski, that idea of giving the lead responsibility to the Afghans, how quickly can that be achieved under Rasmussen?
It's going to take a long time, and the real problem for NATO isn't so much whether NATO can hand over responsibility to the Afghan forces, but whether NATO is in fact handing over responsibility to the United States Army. And so the real challenge for Rasmussen is going to be twofold, both dealing with that longer-term handover to the Afghan side, but also making sure that as the US surges its military troops, in particular into the south and east, that other NATO allies continue to be engaged in the struggle.
If I could bring you in, Doug Bando, on that very issue of the imbalance between, or the perceived imbalance certainly, of the US and NATO in Afghanistan. A lot of the European countries have actually been quite keen not to send any more troops. Can Rasmussen persuade them to do that, to increase their commitment to Afghanistan?
I think he's going to have a very hard time. You know, with German elections upcoming, I mean, this is a very unpopular stand within Europe. The Europeans don't see a great need to be involved. Many of the forces that are there already have limitations or caveats on the use of those forces. It's going to be very hard to convince the Europeans to put more forces in when many of the European people, as opposed to their governments, just don't see the necessity in terms of their interest.
Inderjit Palmer, do you think that he's going to, how is he going to sell that then in that case to NATO countries, the idea of, you know, participating more in Afghanistan?
Well, it's going to be a very difficult thing to sell. I'm not really sure how he's going to sell it. There are other factors involved as well. You know, the economic and financial crises that countries find themselves in can be added to the unpopularity of the wars within public opinion. So he's going to have to try to persuade them that if they want to have influence in the world alongside the United States, then they may be called upon to make some sacrifices. So actually buck up public opinion and take it on for the kind of the longer term power of those forces in the world.
Inderjit Palmer, just staying with you, that this idea, this message that the mission is crucial for European security by preventing Afghanistan from becoming what he calls a grand central station of international terrorism, does that message play with public opinion?
It may well play with public opinion to a certain extent, but I suspect it will depend upon the concrete threats that the public perceive. So the levels of alert and fear and anxiety will have to be considerably higher than they may be at the moment for them to take it more seriously.
Doug Bando, do you think NATO's survival depends on European countries committing more to Afghanistan, or is it not as drastic as that?
Well, it's certainly very important because the question becomes, what is NATO's role? If NATO is not willing to come together on a mission like this, what will it do? What roles will it fulfill? I think this goes to the larger issue of the European vision of the world and the European Union, the desire for a separate defense identity. Now, the European Union and Europeans have focused more on economic and diplomacy, less on the military. I think the challenges of the European people willing to fund and willing to create and support military action, that gives the Europeans a larger stake militarily in the world. If they won't do it in Afghanistan, I'm not sure where they're willing to do it at. And then NATO becomes very unbalanced. If, quite frankly, on this side of the ocean, the question becomes, what's in it for America? The U.S. Should defend the Europeans. What will the Europeans do in terms of, perceived military interests, supporting the United States? So I think if not survival, it's certainly a very serious challenge.
Daniel Korski, would you agree with that assessment of...
I don't think it's so straightforward as to say the Europeans as against the Americans. I mean, in the south of Afghanistan, there's a sort of minor coalition, if you will, a coalition of the willing inside NATO that also consists of a number of European countries, including the Brits, the Danes, the Dutch, and so on. So I don't think it's as straightforward as to say the Europeans aren't willing to fight, the Americans are. But there's clearly a division inside Europe about how serious hard power, military power is, and where in the world the Europeans collectively want to project that power. We're seeing mixed signs. On the one hand, the Germans seem very reluctant, particularly in the run-up to their general election later this year, to commit more troops. But we did see recently the Spanish Prime Minister indicate that he would be willing to send more troops to the west of Afghanistan. So it's not quite a clear picture. It's not quite US and Europe, and it's not quite the US that wants to fight and the Europeans who do not. But there is a serious conversation to be had with NATO's European allies about the extent to which they want to contribute to this military effort.
Inderjit Palmer, in terms of contribution to the military effort, does selling it as perhaps people to train the Afghan army and the Afghan police work better in terms of getting people to commit troops and people on the ground, rather than these people being part of a sort of a strictly military operation? And is that part of NATO's role?
Well, certainly within public opinion, various segments of public opinion, I suspect that training and of the Afghan military would be less unpopular, because it would suggest there's a long-term strategy to ensure that the Afghan military itself takes care of security internally. I suspect that will play much more easily with public opinion. On the other hand, casualties, if they were to occur, would begin to diminish that ardour itself. Going to the point made by one of the other speakers about the relative division of labour and roles between the European Union and the United States, it seems to me that there is a kind of an effective basis for going forward for these powers, because the United States tends to be far more willing and able to engage in military use of military force, whereas the Europeans tend to be far more sensitive to issues related to the building of institutions, for example.
Doug Barndo, if I could just bring you in on the sort of perceived differences between sort of NATO and the US in approach. Do you think that the strategy will also now have to involve, from the NATO point of view, attempts to, I don't know, talk to the Taliban?
Well, in my view, yes. I think the problem we're dealing with is a set of goals. It was relatively easy to throw the Taliban out of power and to get rid of training camps of al-Qaeda. It's extraordinarily difficult to try to build governing institutions, especially central governing institutions in a country like Afghanistan. So I think the U.S. and NATO, together have to consider the ultimate goal. Is the ultimate goal some kind of a stable central state, focused in Kabul, or is it some kind of a political accommodation that avoids having Afghanistan as a terrorism central, but nevertheless might have the Taliban or other forces involved that we would prefer not to be involved, but nevertheless might be the most realistic option? I think that has to be on the table within European and U.S. discussions.
OK, just now I would like to move on to the relations between NATO and Russia, which of course Rasmussen talked about. He said he intends to form a true strategic partnership with Russia during his term in office. He stressed that NATO is not an enemy of Russia. On the contrary, he said that they had similar areas of interest and shared security goals.
There is clearly scope for us to work together on counter-terrorism, on Afghanistan, on piracy, on non-proliferation, and many other areas as well. Now, I'm not a dreamer. It is obvious that there will be fundamental issues on which we disagree. We have to insist, for example, that Russia fully complies with its international obligations, including respecting the territorial integrity and political freedom of its neighbors. But we cannot let those areas of disagreement poison the whole relationship. So my message to the Russian leadership and people is clear. Let us build trust on cooperation and base our cooperation on shared interests.
Well, relations between Russia and NATO have been strained since the five-day war between Russia and Georgia in August last year. Russia's recognition of the breakaway Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia triggered the worst tension in almost 2 decades between the Kremlin and the West. It also alarmed some of Russia's neighbours. Many of these countries are NATO members. They're now concerned that better relations between Moscow and NATO could come at their expense. Well, let's go back to our guests to discuss that further. If I could come to you, Daniel Korski, this idea of a strategic partnership with Russia, how would that work exactly?
I mean, first of all, it's important to recognise that the new NATO Secretary General is sort of following in the US President's lead. Barack Obama started this process of reaching out to the Russian leadership, resetting the relationship famously between the US and Russia. And in a sense, the NATO Secretary General is following through. And what we saw here was the NATO chief saying some of the areas that could be a basis for collaboration. Counterterrorism is one, cooperation in Afghanistan, perhaps not through Russian forces in Afghanistan, but certainly perhaps assistance to some kind of development effort, transit agreement so that NATO forces can transport equipment through Russian territory. And of course there remains this large question that the NATO Secretary General didn't mention explicitly, but is vexing many minds in the West, which is Iran, and how to get Russia to help NATO and the NATO alliance deal with the threat that Iran could potentially pose or poses.
Just to initially to go back to the former Soviet satellite states. I mean, some of them are quite worried about this new détente with Russia. I mean, are they right to think that it could be at their expense?
I mean, they're particularly concerned following the war over Georgia. I don't think they're right to be concerned about military action. I don't think Moscow currently has any plans or any intentions to exercise its military power. But it is true that the Russian leadership has in the past been willing to use all sorts of other kind of shall we say, tools of power to get their way in the eastern neighborhood. Energy being one tool, but another being cyber attacks. And Estonia, a NATO member, was under a ferocious cyber attack just a few years ago. Suspected of emanating from Russia and indeed being controlled by the Moscow leadership. So they have reason to be concerned about certain Russian actions, but not to see Russia as a strategic threat or indeed as a country willing to use military force directly on them. No.
Inderjit Palmer, would you agree with that assessment? And do you think there is a possibility of a common agenda between NATO and Russia?
I think on a fairly sort of limited range of issues. And possibly not in great depth, there probably is. But I think there is a necessity to also see that there are some fundamental conflicts of interest between NATO and expanding NATO and Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, former Soviet president, himself pointed out that there was quite an understanding between the United States and the Russians in the 1990s that NATO would not expand into the former Soviet territories. And there's a clear feeling amongst quite a large swathe of opinion in Russia that NATO is doing just that, and that there is a sort of encirclement policy in operation once again. So although there can be some levels of tactical cooperation, I suspect that there are large numbers of people who think that there's going to be some fundamental conflicts which could be quite serious in the future.
Doug Barndo, do you think that's right, that the expansion of NATO is partly what, the source of the conflict here between Russia and NATO?
Well, certainly. I mean, the Russians are not stupid. From their standpoint, it's hard to see the expansion of NATO as anything except an expansion of alliance directed against them. And, if you simply look at the territory, from their standpoint, Georgia and the borders, territories matter a lot more to them than to Western Europe and certainly to the United States. So I think they do feel betrayed. I mean, there's an argument about whether that was ever promised, but you can certainly see the Russian standpoint. The Cold War ends without a shot, war is avoided, the Red Army recedes, and lo and behold, the Western alliance expands. I do think the West needs to take that into account and ask, is this really worth it? And frankly, what is the purpose of NATO? The purpose of NATO originally was to defend against the Soviet Union. Should NATO, in fact, expand into territory that not only was part of the Soviet Union, but frankly part of the Russian Empire? That raises real questions about what the alliance is about. I think that needs to be taken into account. Russia matters. There are a lot of issues from North Korea to Iran to terrorism where they can be helpful. To the extent we manage to antagonize them, we may lose cooperation on some very important issues.
Just on that very point, NATO's new Secretary General has also said he thinks it's about time that NATO had a new strategic concept. The last time NATO drew up an overall strategy was in 1999, well before today's global challenges, as we're talking about just now, like terrorism, cyber attacks and piracy in Somalia. They've also become NATO's concern. Rasmussen has appointed former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to head a committee of 12 experts debating NATO's future strategy. They'll discuss challenges that NATO will face over the next decade and how it should respond to them. The final approval of the new strategy is expected at the Alliance's next summit in Lisbon late next year. Inderjit Palmer, do you think that, what does this concept of a strategic concept need to be, and how detailed does it have to be?
Well, it's interesting that Madeleine Albright is chairing the committee to develop the concept. Madeleine Albright is a champion of democratization, democracy promotion since she was a Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, and even earlier than that. She's also somebody who's championed the Council for Community of Democracies. So I suspect that the strategic concept that NATO, which it has in effect already been using for a decade or more, I suspect is going to be democracy promotion, and some of the elements and components that go along with that. There'll be struggle for hearts and minds, for example, probably a degree of nation building, and that kind of thing. Many of those are key elements of democracy promotion.
Can I bring in Daniel Korski? What do you think? And when should NATO be taking the lead? And is that what this document needs to set out? What does it need to do, really, to kind of focus minds?
It needs to be NATO's strategic blueprint for a new era. What is it the alliance is for? What can we agree on? And what should NATO leave to others? I don't agree that NATO is going to take on the challenge of democratization or nation building. I think in many ways, a lot of people are going to counsel that this strategic concept shouldn't be too ambitious, that the era for grand ambition is probably drawing to a close. But instead, I think it's going to have a real trouble, real difficulty bridging over the sort of three different parts that now make up NATO. Some countries who fear, as we said earlier, Russia, some countries who want to fight in places like Afghanistan, and a third category of countries who basically just want to keep their heads down and don't want to be bothered, don't want to spend money on defense, don't want to send their troops anywhere. And so the concept for it to make sense needs to both talk about threats, but also bind these three different camps inside the NATO alliance together.
Doug Barndo, do you think the US should still be part of NATO?
Well, I think the U.S. should raise the question, what is America's role these days? And if there's a threat, why aren't the Europeans capable of dealing with it, at least in terms of Russia? I'm concerned about the division within Europe itself. I think, as expressed earlier, there clearly are varying degrees within Europe of a willingness to use military force. We're going to see a challenge even for Great Britain, which has been one of the most willing to partner with the U.S. in terms of its military budget. A lot of discussions about the future of its nuclear deterrent, future of its military budget. And it's not clear to me what NATO's role is today. It had a clear role during the Cold War, but today it's not so clear. And I think the idea of expanding membership, for example, to a country like Georgia, makes countries less secure rather than more secure by bringing them into potential conflict with Russia. So it's not obvious to me what that role is. NATO is predominantly a military alliance. What is that alliance supposed to do? Things like nation building and other proposals don't work very well, I think, for that alliance. And can that military alliance survive if the Europeans in general, if not every country, but in general are moving away from stronger militaries and a willingness to use military action? So I think there really needs to be a more fundamental discussion about NATO's role in a post-Cold War world where the European Union itself has 10 times the GDP of Russia, the most obvious threat. It's not clear to me what that alliance with the United States then should be doing in today's world.
Inderjit Palmer, would you agree with that it's sort of the mandate isn't really clear and that needs to be outlined?
Well, I think that's right. It is correct that it's unclear. NATO was a Cold War organization. It was formed a few years before the Warsaw Treaty, by the way. It was seen by many as an aggressive military institution, which was the kind of a military counterpart of the Marshall Plan to undergird the security and the economic security of Western Europe. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, really, NATO ought to have gone with it. It was there supposedly to ward off the threat. The threat disappeared. However, it suggests to me that there are other factors involved in the formation of Cold War organizations other than Soviet threats. That is, a degree to which you can say that within the United States and within the West there were aggressive and expansionist forces. NATO's expansion to far beyond North Atlantic territories, to now include Australia, New Zealand, Korea and Japan as contact countries, suggests that there was some other intent to Western power from the very beginning. So there's going to be a change in the role of organizations of that type. Hence my point about Madeleine Albright, who does think globally about the role of the United States and its key institutions and organizations.
Doug Bondo, if I could just bring you back in on that issue of expansion of NATO, is that necessarily, in your view, a bad thing?
Oh, I think it is today. I think that my view is the role of NATO was to protect the security, fundamental security of the United States and Europe. I think that bringing in countries now that have very little, effective military capability, but enormous potential for problems in terms of internal political problems, both Ukraine and Georgia, for example, as well as potential border disputes with Russia, which is a nuclear armed power. I mean, war with Russia would be something very different from war with Serbia or war with Iraq. That it's being done kind of willy-nilly, as if, quite frankly, the NATO was the EU promoting democracy and political stability. But in fact, it's a military alliance with an Article 5 measure willing to go to war. I think it's being done rather frivolously, pulling the alliance, both the United States and Europe, into potential conflict in areas where, frankly, their fundamental security really is not at stake.
Okay.
And it's, frankly, making the area more rather than less stable.
Daniel Korski, is that fair? Do you think NATO can end up making areas less stable than they would be otherwise?
I mean, there is a potential for that to happen, but we have to recognize that there's another side of this discussion, which is, are these countries in fact even ready to become part of NATO? I think there was a great rush during the Bush administration to pretend that they were, but the truth is the Ukrainians are deeply split about whether they want to join NATO, about half and half. And in Georgia, they have shown not to have the requisite institutional framework, political maturity to even join an alliance. So there's another question, which is, we're discussing this as if it was a realistic prospect, but these countries, even if we wanted them to join, could not meet the NATO criteria that were laid out by earlier Secretaries General. So this is not really something that we ought to concern ourselves with, probably for the next decade or so. Then we can come back to the question as to whether we want to enlarge with them and what consequences it may have. I do think, though, that the expansion of NATO, certainly in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, has produced this zone of peace. It has laid certain criteria for how countries must behave. It has laid certain criteria for what kind of structures they must have in their defense establishment, all of which have been good and consolidated democracy. Okay,
well, on that positive note, I'm afraid we've run out of time for this discussion, but thank you very much to our guests. In Washington, D.C., Doug Bondo, a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. In London, Daniel Korski, a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Kuala Lumpur, Professor Inderjit Palmer from Manchester University in the UK, Head of Politics there. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining our discussion. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.